In this short video, I'm just going to skim through the play and highlight a few things that are worth pursuing in terms of thinking about tragedy. So I'm going to give you an overview of the play very rapidly. Word of warning, that's not how you want to respond to the play in an exam with very rapid response to lots and lots of features of the play, but you want to select a few key features and analyse them in relation to the question. And there's another video which I'll make where we'll look at how to respond to questions. However, this is just to particularly mention scenes that weren't covered in the other videos. So obviously the tragedy begins in Act 1, Scene 1 with Richard at his height of power in the play, but that power already been undermined and questioned, and the end of the scene giving the suggestion that he's much weaker than he perceives himself to be, and his hamartia, his sort of flawed personality, is set up as somebody who vacillates, who's manipulable, and who is perhaps absorbed in his own sense of importance without really understanding the pressures that are there and could come and depose him. The second scene is interesting in that it now gives us an insight into what was happening in the first scene. So it's like almost the reverse of dramatic irony, that now we know something that Gaunt knew all the way through the previous scene, that it was almost certain that Richard was responsible for his uncle's death. The thing that Bolingbroke is complaining about, really, that someone, Mowbray, was responsible for killing Richard's uncle. But it seems likely from what Gaunt says in this scene to the Duchess that Richard was in fact ultimately responsible for that death. Now that is part of the creating almost a tragic villain out of Richard, that he is a Machiavellian, manipulative and cruel and hard character, really, who's happy to order the death of his own uncle. So it adds to the early part of the play where Richard is seen in a largely unfavourable light. The third scene obviously has that important dramatic moment of the potential of a trial by combat that is halted, and then obviously the engine of the tragedy, the thing that Richard gets wrong here, in his own sort of self-absorption, he doesn't realise that treating Bolingbroke and Mowbray as he does is storing up problems for himself in the future. So banishing Bolingbroke upsets both Bolingbroke and Gaunt especially, turns them into enemies really, and Bolingbroke is now set up to be his kind of avenging angel. And at this point we're still rather likely to perhaps favour Bolingbroke, and there's some emotional scenes between Bolingbroke and Gaunt that might make him seem more of a likeable and interesting character than he appears later on in the play. We then see a brief scene 4, which I mentioned in my analysis of Act 2, Scene 1, in that it sets up a couple of aspects of Richard's personality, again, which make us seem to dislike him. That he is ignorant of the value of winning over the support of the people, and out mocking really of Bolingbroke's attempt to win the people's interest. And then he's very rude and dismissive of his uncle's illness and wishes death on him, really. So another example of him not being a very good family member. We also see here Richard with his entourage, his followers, his hangers-on, and this is the thing that people complain about to do with him later in the play, particularly Bolingbroke himself. But here, this is the only time we really see this in detail, that Richard is kind of frivolous and careless and unsympathetic in his dealings with those people who encourage that. 2-1 we looked at in a previous video, and obviously that is the turning point in the play where Richard makes the fatal error of seizing Gaunt's lands and goods when he dies and depriving thereby Bolingbroke of what he believes to be his rightful inheritance. By doing that, obviously he gives Bolingbroke a good reason to come back to Britain to claim his inheritance, and then that turns into a challenge to Richard's authority overall. We also remember that the scene ends in a classic Shakespearean tragedy way with people plotting and with the sense that Richard has misjudged the scene and misunderstood what's going on, and that people are now starting to work against him. And things happen very rapidly in this play in that way. We see a brief scene, and we haven't mentioned much about the Queen in the other videos, but she is in almost separate scenes. She was actually in the previous scene, but has only one line. In other scenes, she's separated out from all the other characters. She has two little scenes of her own, and then one final scene in which she meets Richard again. Now, in this one, we see the Queen interacting quite happily with Bushy, for instance, at the start there, and Green as well, who comes in, and that goes rather against what Bolingbroke claims later, that Bushy and Green have intervened between Richard and his Queen, and that they perhaps were lovers with Richard, and the Queen resents that. Well, there doesn't seem to be any problem between Bushy Green and the Queen here. They seem to be getting along quite well, but what we do find out, and the movement of the play is really fast here, is that already we hear that Bolingbroke is back. He's coming back to Britain, and so the threat is already there. Richard's gone off to Ireland and hasn't waited long enough to realise that Bolingbroke is on his way back. And so York is thrust into this position of trying to do something about it, but feeling that perhaps he can't because he hasn't got the resources to resist Bolingbroke. Bushy, Green and Bagot at the end of the scene sort of discussed their future and realised that if Bolingbroke does return, they're going to be targets to him. And they all sort of decide, well, we need to get out of this, we need to escape. And Bagot does, but Bushy and Green do not. And then we see Act 2, Scene 3, already, the rapidity of things. Already Bolingbroke is back in Britain, and he's getting support from Northumberland, who we heard plotting earlier, and Northumberland's son Percy. And so this is part of that early part of the play where we're building up that maybe Bolingbroke is the hero who's coming to relieve Britain of this ill-judged rule of Richard. And then we get York caught in the middle. He's an interesting character in that he wants to serve the king, and because the king is still Richard at the moment, he's going to serve Richard. But once Bolingbroke becomes king, he serves Bolingbroke with equal loyalty. So he's loyal to the king, whoever that is, not to any particular individual person. And he quickly realises that he can't really resist Bolingbroke, and so he sort of invites him to come with him, and he doesn't quite surrender, but he certainly doesn't offer any resistance. There's a brief scene 4 in Act 2 which just shows that the Welsh soldiers that Richard thinks are waiting for him have now already deserted him because he's been too late coming back, and they don't think he's coming, or they assume he's dead, as it's said later. And then we get that scene 1 of Act 3, where we start to see a different Bolingbroke, maybe, and realise that he's not heroic in any meaningful sense, in that he's a bloody figure. He's harsh and dismissive of Bushy and Green, accuses them of things that don't seem to be true from what we've seen earlier, and then he sends them to be executed. So the regime that Bolingbroke's bringing to replace the corrupt regime of Richard doesn't seem at this point necessarily to be preferable, although in some interpretations it's seen that he is strong, and that's what he's doing. He's being decisive, he's getting rid of the corruption, but it also could be seen that he's a rather brutal dictator. We've looked in detail at Act 3, Scene 2. That's Richard's arrival back in Britain and his vacillation between hope and despair, which goes up and down throughout the scene, and it makes him into perhaps a pitiable figure, but certainly also still somewhat irritating figure, if you like, and someone who we don't really side with fully, even though we've had some doubts now, maybe more about Bolingbroke. And that's carried on into Scene 3 of Act 3, where Bolingbroke and Richard confront one another. We don't really see much to admire about Bolingbroke, but then we see Richard as being rather brittle in his power there, and we see this as the tragic downfall unfolding, that he can't hold on to power here, even though he makes a few rather braggish sort of comments about him being still in charge. It's clear that he's not. And it's rather all done unspokenly, which is strange. Nothing is ever directly said, but it's clear that by the end of the scene, he's given up power to Bolingbroke. Even though Bolingbroke says, "Oh well, I'm loyal to you," and Richard says, "Oh, you can have everything you've asked for." So it's a bit odd that then it's like, but I am also going to resign my kingship to you. So that leads us into a final scene in Act 3, which is another of those Queen scenes, and it's very much a scene outside of the rest of the play in many ways, in which we're in the garden, and the Queen she's always melancholy and unhappy, but here she's overhears some gardeners talking about Richard and how he hasn't led the country as well as they've done their gardening. He hasn't weeded out corruption, and he hasn't fostered things in the right way. And so it's a commentary on Richard as a leader. For the Queen, we feel sorry for her. She's still very loyal to Richard and is throughout the play. She offers, obviously, again, that idea of the feminine voice, which is unheard in the play, except in a few moments. Duchess of Gloucester in Act 1, her voice has no authority or power whatsoever. And the Queen here, she has no power. She's nothing she can do about what she's hearing. She's just resentful and upset, really, that she hears the gardener talking negatively about Richard. Act 4 obviously is the deposition scene, and so he is deposed in that scene, although here we start to really see Richard as a more interesting character than Bolingbroke, really, and the way that he sort of mocks and delays and poeticizes the scene makes him much more interesting character than Bolingbroke, and he starts to take on more of an image of a tragic hero, although of course Richard himself, sees his own tragic heroic status very clearly too, and even wants to kind of watch it in a mirror. He's that obsessed with it, and so there's a sense that he is very much acting out his own tragedy here and almost enjoying observing it. The final Queen scene is Act 5, Scene 1, and it's the farewell scene. It's generally thought to be a little formulaic and not very emotional. Is it intended to be so? Or are we intended to feel sorry for the Queen and feel sorry for Richard here as they part in awkward circumstances? They sort of meet on the road as they've been taken off to different prisons. And is this a sort of tragic and sad farewell, and this couple who do seem very loyal to each other must be forced to part? But they speak in rather kind of ornate and perhaps overly artificial ways that perhaps take away some of the emotion for some readers and viewers. The odd little side issue comes in for 2 scenes after that, and that's where the tragedy sort of takes a little diversion. Otherwise, the tragedy is pretty full on Richard's downfall, but here we see York's character, who's been bubbling in the background of the play as a character wrestling with his conscience, and here his conscience takes a dip, although to begin with we do get an image of Bolingbroke and Richard, which is again adding to the sense of tragedy, in that Bolingbroke rides through London and is cheered, and Richard is just sort of ignored and despised, and it's rather sad and pathetic. But then we get this idea that Armel comes in, York's son, and the Duchess of York's son, of course, as well, and it seems clear that he is plotting something to try to support Richard's return to the throne. So treason. And York takes the very kind of political line of, I'm going to support the king, and if I know there's treason going on, I will give up my son rather than support or ignore treason. So there's this issue of where family stands in the character's concerns, and it doesn't stand highly enough usually. Richard didn't seem very family orientated in that he seems to have organised the death of one uncle and laughed at the other as he died, and here York seems to put politics and doing his duty above the love of his own son, and the Duchess of York adds that dimension of the female voice that is so unheard in the play. And she says she resists the argument of York very strongly, and reminds him that if you had grown for him, if you'd had given birth to this boy, you might feel a little bit more sympathy for the thought of him dying. And she's a strong figure. I will not peace, she says. I will not shut up. Saying it in that rather awkward way, I will not peace, sort of really highlights her directness and her forcefulness, I think. So she's an interesting character. And then we get this funny little scene afterwards where they all rush to get to Henry first, and it's York who gets there first, and in front of the Duchess. Armel gets in before him, though. It's interesting that Henry's talking about his own son at the start of the scene, and that becomes the theme of the next play. But Henry is talking there about how he can't control his own son. And then, so family again sort of being thrust up to the front of the play. Armel gets in first. He begs forgiveness rather than attempting to attack Henry, although Henry leaves himself open to being attacked, sends everybody else out. Then York's bashing at the door saying, watch out, you've got a murderer in there. And then the Duchess comes rushing in saying, don't do anything to Armel, forgive him. And Bolingbroke seems sort of almost amused by this family dispute that's going on in front of him, and seems to forgive him, Armel. We get a little scene with Exton then saying, I'm going to kill Richard, so the build-up of some drama there, and then the final Richard scene in which eventually he is killed after being attacked by Exton and a couple of other murderers. And so at the end of the tragedy sees Richard defeated in the most bleak sort of circumstances. But we do get a final aftermath scene after that sort of climax and catastrophe. We get an aftermath in which Exton seeks reward for murdering Richard and is dismissed by Henry in a scene that's full of references to people being murdered and killed because they are rebelling against Henry. So the scene seems to leave the sense that Henry is very dissatisfied at the end of the play. And so, again, suffering throughout the play. Everybody seems to suffer in one way or another, whether it's the Duchess of Gloucester suffering in mourning near the early part of the play, whether it's Mowbray and Bolingbroke being banished, and Gaunt suffering the loss of his son, Gaunt dying, Richard himself then obviously suffering the thought that he is not able to defeat Bolingbroke and that his own soldiers have deserted him. Bolingbroke, of course, suffers impatience as he waits for the kingship, and then at the end he seems to suffer the fact that he too will be rebelled against. So it's a tragic world in which nobody is happy.